What's going on, everybody? James Hancock here. Hope everyone's having a great weekend. Back to review Outlaw King, a movie that came out on Netflix yesterday. Outlaw King stars Chris Pine as the famous Robert the Bruce, who back in the 14th century managed to successfully repel the much larger, much better funded English army. The movie is directed by David Mackenzie, the man behind Hell or High Water, a movie I really enjoyed. And it should also be said that David Mackenzie is from Scotland. And in that I am not remotely an expert on Scottish history, I'm going to defer to David Mackenzie's superior knowledge of his own culture and just assume, rightly or wrongly, that he gets most of the story right from a historical standpoint. But in that the character Robert the Bruce was one of the characters in Braveheart, and in that this movie tackles a very similar topic, inevitably people are going to be making comparisons between Braveheart and Outlaw King. And if people wish to do so, more power to them, but I would argue that Braveheart and Outlaw King are two very different movies. First and foremost, Braveheart is this giant, romantic, sweeping epic with a lot of emotion and a lot of heart. I had just graduated from high school when that movie came out, and I was at Beach Week. My friends and I, we all went to see it. We all had an absolute blast, and that movie basically took over for about a year. People were buying it on VHS. They were quoting it ad nauseum. Braveheart was just one of those lightning in a bottle phenomenons where it just took over popular culture for a while. And while I don't think David Mackenzie would resent it if his movie were to suddenly become very popular, but I don't get the feeling that he was going for this giant piece of crowd-pleasing, kind of Oscar bait entertainment like Mel Gibson was. This movie is much more grounded, much more gritty, much more brutal in a lot of ways. And I'm not going to tell you the movie doesn't have its fair share of flaws. Apparently at the last minute, David Mackenzie had to cut about 20 minutes from the movie because a lot of people were complaining about some pacing issues when it was playing at festivals. And as I started watching it yesterday, I was initially having a little trouble getting into it, but around like the 45-minute mark or so, suddenly I found myself completely, totally absorbed. I absolutely loved it. I think Braveheart is the far stronger movie and the far more satisfying experience overall. That said, Outlaw King is absolutely well worth a look, especially if you're interested in medieval history or in Scottish history. On my dad's side of the family, I got a little Scottish ancestry. I've always had a sentimental affection for Scottish culture. Been to Edinburgh on 2 separate occasions, and I have to say it's my favorite place to visit outside of the United States, and the Scottish accent is my favorite accent in the world. I'm always a little confused as to when I should say Scottish versus Scotch versus Scots. So if I occasionally mess that up, I apologize. I like to drink Scotch, and I think it's accurate to say that the characters in this movie are Scottish, but there's a good chance I might get those 3 terms mixed up from time to time. But I think the biggest obstacle between this movie and a wider audience is the fact that Chris Pine is playing Robert the Bruce. I'm a big fan of Chris Pine. I think he's done a lot of great movies. But anytime you have a movie with an American star, with a largely British cast, in a British setting for the story, I always kind of hold my breath, waiting for the moment where inevitably they're going to completely butcher their accent. It's almost like watching a train wreck in slow motion. For some reason, British actors seem to excel at American accents. I've never quite understood why, but when American actors try to do the reverse, inevitably they come up short. And while I think Chris Pine brings a bunch of emotional intensity and he brings this great physical presence, there are times in the movie where it almost seems like he's trying not to talk at all, or he's almost kind of growling and grumbling his words. And when you're surrounded by all these very colorful characters speaking in these outrageous Scottish accents, it just makes him seem like he doesn't quite fit into the story. So I would say on the surface, that's the one big flaw. That said, about halfway through the movie, I was really enjoying his characterization of Robert the Bruce. In particular, I really enjoyed the romance between Robert the Bruce and Elizabeth de Burgh. Elizabeth is actually English. She and Robert the Bruce basically have an arranged marriage as a way of trying to seal the temporary peace between Scotland and England. Because at the beginning of the movie, we see the Scottish nobility surrendering to Edward I of England. For you Game of Thrones fans out there, Edward I is played by Stephen Delane, who you'll recognize as Stannis Baratheon, who some still feel is the one true king of Westeros. In any event, this movie begins with this rather shaky peace, and William Wallace, the character from Braveheart, is still on the loose. But when William Wallace is finally captured and drawn and quartered, and basically pieces of his body are sent to different cities around Scotland, you have yet another uprising, and Robert the Bruce, although he's untested in battle, becomes the new king of Scotland, and we really get to see him trying to build up a legitimate army from scraps, basically with 40 loyal men. And then slowly but surely, after a few early defeats, eventually rising to a level where he repels the English and Scotland is able to regain their independence. One interesting historical note which I did not know until the closing credits, Robert the Bruce had a descendant 300 years later who would become both King of Scotland and England. But mostly this movie is about Robert the Bruce trying to convince his fellow Scots that he is the right man to lead them in the battle. Because initially Scotland is filled with all these warring factions, in particular those loyal to John Comyn, who has an equally valid claim to the throne. Robert the Bruce and John John Common basically get in an argument in a church early on in the movie, and Robert the Bruce kills him then and there. So while Robert the Bruce is traveling around Scotland trying to build an army, he's also being attacked by his own people. At the same time, he has to deal with young Edward, the Prince of Wales. Prince Edward is not nearly the man that his father is, but he's desperate to prove both to his men and to his father that one day he will be a legitimate king. The problem is that he's basically a spoiled brat. He's proud, he's insecure, he makes a lot of mistakes, he's horrifically brutal and savage. So he's basically traveling from village to village and castle to castle, murdering and dismembering people who might be loyal to Robert the Bruce. And looking back on the movie, I have to say, I'm pretty impressed by the whole experience overall, and I will definitely be watching this movie again. But because this movie has had some lukewarm reviews, and because a lot of people are going out of their way to bash it, I do want to call attention to a lot of the things that this movie does really well. First and foremost, apart from my reservations about Chris Pine, the cast is absolutely incredible. Florence Pugh, or Pugh, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce her name, she plays Elizabeth Berg. Because she's English, she really finds herself in a situation where she's torn between loyalty to her family and loyalty to her new husband. But in the end, she basically chooses her new husband, chooses his vision. But she has to go through some pretty brutal torment along the way, because she and her stepdaughter at one point are captured by the English. They basically hang her in a cage off the side of a castle, completely exposed to the elements. Aaron Taylor Johnson was a huge surprise. I had no idea that he was in this. I'm used to him popping up in superhero movies like Kick-Ass and Avengers Age of Ultron, but he plays a character named James Douglas, and due to the actions of his father, he's had his family lands and his castle taken away from him. So he basically swears to be Robert the Bruce's bodyguard and protector, hoping he'll have the opportunity to get his land back. But he just has this absolutely savage, ruthless persona. And obviously, Aaron Taylor Johnson is an incredibly strong physical actor, but of all the actors in this movie, when it comes to the combat scenes, he probably does the best job. He has this way of running into combat with a sword in one hand and a knife in another, where it basically looks like he could take on the entire English army all by himself. Billy Howe is really good as Edward, Prince of Wales as well, because I think it takes some real talent to play somebody that the audience will absolutely openly revile and despise. He's such a little petulant boy emperor in so many ways, who's always trying way too hard to prove himself. And in a movie filled with a lot of poverty and a lot of mud and a lot of brutality, he's always impeccably attired. His armor is insanely cool looking. While I might hate the character that he plays in the movie, no one can deny that he wears the best looking armor of anybody in the entire movie. And I've seen a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows dealing with fantasy and medieval times, and I have to say, his armor in this movie might be my favorite armor that I've ever seen on screen. And in probably the most horrific, brutal, traumatizing scene of the movie, he comes to a castle, he's interrogating Robert the Bruce's brother, asking if he's seen Robert the Bruce. His brother lies on his behalf. So Prince Edward has his men wrap a rope around this guy's neck, pull him up about 10 feet into the air, and Prince Edward just walks over with a knife, stabs into his belly, completely disembowels him. And it is so real looking and so horrific. You basically think they've disemboweled an actor for real, and as his entrails and intestines all just burst out and hang down around his legs and start dripping down to the ground. From the reviews that I've read, I think a lot of people have been turned off by this movie because they think the movie was excessively violent. But I imagine anybody who lived in the 14th century would probably say, you know what? Life was brutal back then. Life was tough, and getting drawn and quartered should never be depicted in a soft and fuzzy light. And that attention to detail is something that pervades this film that just made it fascinating to watch. Early on, we see a trebuchet in action, and I wish they'd use this thing more often. But when King Edward is basically accepting the Scottish surrender that opens the movie, they use a trebuchet with a Greek fire to attack a castle and tear it down. And just seeing it in action is a legitimate thrill. I think this movie also deserves high marks for its use of cinematography. It makes Scotland look so incredible and so peaceful and so beautiful. And from the way the camera's moving, I think they're using a lot of drones to get this photography. But it's not just shameless scenery in order to try to show off the natural beauty of Scotland. At one point, they're using this beautiful cinematography as a way of lulling the audience into an artificial feeling of safety. We have Robert the Bruce and a bunch of his men with a couple of boats, and they're trying to get across this lake. And because they have too many men and too few boats, they're taking turns. And as they do so, you get these stunning vistas of the lake and these stunning vistas of the forest surrounding the landscape. And at one point, Robert the Bruce is just kind of gazing longingly across the lake, and he sees moving through the woods are all these Scottish savages who are loyal to John Common. So suddenly, the most beautiful scene you've ever seen in a movie turns into one of the most horrific, where you have Scot versus Scot just throwing spears at each other, throwing hand axes at each other. This movie absolutely holds nothing back in terms of just the sheer brutality of hand-to-hand combat, with people basically up to their waists in either mud or water. It's not pretty, it's not chivalrous, it's not elegant. Because at certain points in the movie, both the English and the Scottish decide just to abandon chivalry altogether. Before the last big battle of the movie, Robert the Bruce says, look, God and honor have no place here. It's time to fight like beasts. And they absolutely do. But what's cool is that as savage and brutal as the violence in the movie might be, there's no shaky cam. I absolutely loathe and despise shaky cam. I don't know a single person on this planet that likes watching shaky cam. Most people who are watching a movie about war or combat want to see the spectacle. And even when the battle's taking place like in a trench with spikes, with mud and horses falling in, and all this chaos and bedlam and people falling all over one another, you're able to take in the geography of the land, and you're able to take in the choreography really well, because a big part of this movie is strategy. And if I'm watching a battle scene on film, I want to be able to appreciate how all the chess pieces are moving on the board. And as they're training for battle, we see just how brutally savage things can get, because the Scots have fewer horses, fewer cavalry, and so they're basically training guys on foot with knives how to take on a knight on horseback. And they're showing how one guy approaches the horse and stabs it in the chest, and another guy approaches from the side and pulls the knight from his saddle, and then immediately starts looking for chinks in the armor to stick his knife in. This is not glamorous stuff. And usually when characters in the movie try to be chivalrous, it backfires. The day before Robert the Bruce's first big battle, he challenges the leader of the opposing army to single combat in order to decide the fate of the battle, so basically spare a lot of people's lives. His opponent agrees, they separate, Robert the Bruce goes back to his camp, has a really hot sex scene with his wife. There's actually some abundant nudity, and you do see Chris Pine's penis at one point in this movie when he's bathing in some hot springs. So if you want to see Chris Pine's bod in its full glory, this movie definitely offers that. In any event, as he's trying to get a good night's rest before his duel the following day, suddenly flaming arrows, just like a cloud of them, just start landing on his camp, killing people. Because as it turns out, the English have no intentions of facing him honorably the next day. They'd rather just massacre the camp in the middle of the night. In any event, the movie peaks with this absolutely sensational battle scene where it basically looks like 50 Scots are taking on like 200,000 English, but they choose a terrain where they basically have a swamp on one side to protect their flanks so that mounted cavalry can't ride through it. And they dig a bunch of trenches on either side of this narrow opening. And in these trenches, they're filled with spikes and mud. Basically, you can't cross it. And they goad the English into attacking them. So immediately, England's biggest advantage, the fact that they have all these heavy mounted cavalry, that advantage is taken away because they all ride into this pit of spikes, or they ride around and they get stuck in the swamp, and allows the Scots to fight them on equal footing. And it's probably the muddiest battle scene caught on film since the days of Orson Welles' famous battle scene with Chimes of Midnight back in the mid-60s. And as the movie draws to a close, we get some interesting historical details about where these characters end up. It definitely excited an interest in me in learning more about this period. And luckily, Robert the Bruce is able to make a trade for his wife, so they're reunited, they build a family. So on the whole, for a movie that's as gruesome and brutal as this, it actually does have a relatively happy ending. And I think if this movie didn't have some of the initial pacing issues toward the front of the movie, and if Chris Pine had just managed to nail that accent a little closer, perhaps this movie would be enjoying greater success. And who knows, oftentimes there's a giant disconnect between viewers and critics. I feel like once something's on Netflix, people can decide for themselves, irrespective of what critics have to say. So I'll just close with this. If you like Scottish history, or if you like medieval combat, it is well worth at least giving the movie a shot. I can't promise you'll enjoy it, but it is absolutely worth a look, even if in the end you feel like it doesn't quite measure up to Braveheart. But Braveheart was one of those once-in-a-generation historical epics that just captures the heart of the entire world. It just doesn't happen very frequently. But as somebody who likes watching people in armor fighting, I wish this genre would be explored more frequently. So my hat's off to everybody involved with the film, and I'll definitely be first in line for more movies by David Mackenzie in the future, because at this point, between Hell and High Water and Outlaw King, he's definitely got a lot of good credit in the bank with me, and I'll be very curious to see what he works on next. Oof. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. If you want to talk more about Scottish history and tell me about all the things that I got wrong, you can definitely find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But I can't thank you enough for watching my video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, onwards and upwards.